Alright guys, ask and you shall receive. There were some requests that I had for me trying to track down this deck, so I did manage to do so, and you can read about that and whatever. But I did want to, of course, as always, just give a quick run through of what I found with this deck. Not going to talk about the sideboard, you can see it in the article there, but I don't want to waste too much time focusing on that. Really kind of an interesting deck. This is a 3-color teachings deck that utilizes spell reduction off of familiars and electromancers. So really kind of a cool thing. You can also check out, if you check the article, I'll talk about it here briefly, but some things that I would change about this particular build. This is as it came to me. So kind of the start here, I think, is teachings. This is hands down a teachings deck. No teachings deck should really, in my opinion, run more than 3 copies. So I think 2 fits here nicely because of the fact that this is actually kind of a pretty creature heavy version. And that's mostly for kind of the mana reduction and whatnot. Now, the teachings at 2 copies have quite an array of instants to search out. You have power sinks, which are a really cool X counterspell, and mana leak is your other counterspell option. So you are running control, obviously a little bit small on the counter control, but I think I'm okay with that. I think a teachings deck doesn't really need to be counterspell heavy. I think it looks for better options when it comes to kill and other things like that. And what you do by bringing in black and red is basically give yourself other options to not only kill but also burn, and I think that gives it a little bit more teeth, especially when some of your damage is going to be so ineffective. Power Sync works really well because it's one of these things where if they decide to let that be successful, or if they have no option if that is successful, what happens is that it taps them out. One of the things that I learned, and I discussed this a little bit in the video, is that the reduction ability of the Electromancer and Familiar does count towards the X total of Power Sync. So definitely watch the gameplay videos, you'll see how that works out. I don't want to go into too much detail here. Mana Leak is a pretty good counterspell, but it works obviously better in the early game, because as they get more lands, they have more chances to pay that 3 mana to negate the counter. It's kind of interesting. I debated on whether I thought this needed to be switched with Counterspell. Now, Counterspell works fabulously, obviously, because of the fact that it hard counters. There is nothing that they can do other than playing an additional Counterspell to stop it. But I think Mana Leak fits better in this particular deck because of the fact that you are running 3 colors. Sometimes finding that double blue mana cost in even a 2-color deck can be too much, but when this is running 3 colors, that 1 colorless might be pretty essential for this deck to be able to play that. That being said, some of the lands and the prisms do give you a lot of chance to use the blue. I also thought about maybe some other counterspell options here that might work, like Prohibit. I think Mana Leak works pretty well because of the fact that Prohibit does have some restrictions itself that what it can counter. But I think that'll just come down to personal preference and maybe what you think you'll be playing against. So as far as kill goes, you get options here in Diabolic Edict, which is almost an essential because of the fact that we do see quite a bit of hexproof these days, and things like that. Things like Vines of the Vastwood and ways to get around it. It works as a great ability to kill. Obviously, it does lose some of its power as your opponent gets more and more creatures. Can be a little bit troublesome in a bit of a heavy aggro environment. Electrickery is coming in as our option to do the mass kill. This also was something I debated on whether or not this should be switched to a copy of Echoing Decay. Echoing Decay is going to be able to do more damage in the fact that it gives -2, as opposed to Electrickery, which only does 1 damage, so it can hit a lot more targets. However, I think Electrickery is the correct choice here because of that overload. It can hit multiple things. On a solid Echoing Decay, the most I'm going to be able to do is kill 4 creatures. With a solid Electrickery, you can go well beyond that, especially against things like elves and anything else that relies on several creatures with that 1 toughness, something like Delver Blue maybe. Also running a lot of Stagger Shocks. 3 gives us an opportunity to not only burn, but gives us a chance to kill things that have the 2 toughness or less. I think it is a great thing. This deck works a little bit like Fissure and some of those decks where they run a very small creature base. They, look for damage off of the familiars. You think about familiar, the familiar version of Fissure Storm. I have one of these days. And what that looks to do is do actually quite a bit of damage off of the 1/1 familiars. Now, you also get obviously some 2/2 flyers with the Muldrifters, but the core of the deck is going to be a slow, persistent damage based off of the control that Teachings offers, and this works kind of the same. Oh, man, I keep doing this. Working off the damage that Fissure offers, and this deck works in a similar way, where you're going to be looking to have, even if it's 1 damage per turn, you want to be able to get some of that damage in and control the board state with the rest of the spells in your deck. Now, there are some odd choices from here out, so that's basically your toolbox, and we had talked about what a toolbox means to Teachings before. The deck brings in the Wall plus Ghostly Flicker combo, which is great. The Ghostly Flicker is going to work well here in addition to the Wall because you get some draw off the Muldrifter and the Prism, and I think that's great. I think if you were looking for some card space, making some changes yourself, you could probably drop it down to 1. There's a lot of decks that get away with running a single Wall and a single Ghostly Flicker, especially something like this where you're running Teachings and you have a chance to find it easier. I think maybe going down to a single copy is not going to be so critical and does free you up a little bit of room to find additional spells. Even though, like I said, you get a lot of extra draw off the Prisms and the Muldrifters. We also have an interesting package here in sorceries. Now, sorceries are something you do not usually find in a Teachings deck because Teachings finds only instants. I think the Firebolts here work, actually, even though they are sorceries, because of the flashback. You have these familiars and these reduction spells, and what you're looking to ideally do is do some quick damage off of these Firebolts because of the reduced flashback cost. These Firebolts are going to sit here and account for 6 damage when hard cast the first time, and another 6 when flashed back. So you have a potential of 12 damage off of Firebolts alone. Unfortunately, again, can't be found with the Teachings, but I think they can still find a place in this deck. That being said, I don't think the Ponder has a place. I think the Ponder should be switched. If you are still looking for a little card draw, maybe a Brainstorm is where you want to go because that is instant speed. But I think you can get a little bit more benefit out of switching that Ponder into something else. Now the Prisms. The Prisms might look a little bit janky here, but I really like the inclusion. Prism is something that has been growing on me more and more every time I play with it. It actually works not only as a card draw, but the ability to fix your mana is really important in a 3-color deck like this. You see, he is running a full set of the Grotto. The Grotto is something that is good for mana color changing, but not as good, obviously, as the Prism. If you use a Grotto to change color of mana, you're basically costing yourself 1 mana to do so because you are tapping out the Grotto, and it cannot produce that colorless. If you have a Prism on the field, you want to use that first because it doesn't require you to tap an additional land to change the color. So in a 3-color deck like this, I think the Prism works fantastically because it gives you a lot of opportunity to find the colors you need when you need them, as well as giving you card draw. It's going to work really well as well with the Ghostly Flickers, and if you can get only a Muldrifter and a Prism, that's still 3 cards you're going to be able to draw off of a Ghostly Flicker. You can't complain about that. So creature base, we talked about the Wall. The Familiar and the Electromancer are going to be kind of a very strong core to this deck because of how they affect the casting cost on these spells. The Nightscape Familiar is actually pretty cool because of the fact that it regenerates, gives you chances to kind of hold off a little bit more against some of the more aggro-based decks out there. What you really like to see about this is the Familiar, and you got to keep this in mind some games. The Familiar here reduces the cost of blue and red spells. So that's basically anything, but anytime, and you'll see this in one of the games, that you need black, the Edicts are going to be reduced only by the Electromancers, because the Electromancers work on just instants and sorceries. They are not color-based. So having, a Nightscape Familiar and an Electromancer in play gives you a lot of great opportunities, just with those 2 cards alone, to reduce the cost on your spells. These work really, really great, and I think it's kind of an interesting base that's been put together here. And we'll talk about that just a second when I get to the lands. Not a lot to say about the lands, just mostly the count here. Anyways, the Delver of Secrets, full set here. Definitely something that is worth playing with. It's going to be kind of your big damage in a lot of games once it flips. However, it does struggle a little bit. One of the things about this is obviously it's going to need an instant or sorcery to flip. That's pretty good. However, we are running a decent creature count. 16 is probably, I would not go any further than that if I was running a deck with Delver. And then you have to consider that if a prism is revealed, that is going to basically not flip the Delver either. So you have to consider that there is a good majority of this deck that is not going to flip your Delvers, and you are, again, going to have to basically rely on that 1 damage attack. Mulldrifters are there for the card draw. Also give you pretty good evasion. Not much else you can say about that. Works really well with Ghostly Flicker, gets you a lot of extra cards. Alright, so let's talk about the land count real quick. Now, deck's currently running 22 lands. There is a very fine line with this deck on too many and not enough lands. Now, in testing this just the first time I had been given the list, I had found that there were many games where I had to drop to 4 cards in order to get the lands I needed to get things going. And this is kind of an odd thing. And I started to think, after looking at the list, that maybe that was just a result of some bad luck on the number generator. Because 22 lands, most decks will run 23 to 24 in competitive play. I think 22 is a bit heavy, actually, for this particular deck because of the fact that you have the Electromancer and the Familiars. I think the balance comes in that this can work really well in a very heavy control meta. Anywhere where you're afraid of the Electromancer or the Nightscape Familiar not being able to stay on the field. It's, like I said, a really, really fine line because even though these reduce the cost here, you need to find them to be able to reduce the cost. So I think maybe 21 would be acceptable if you were looking for an additional card space. I would be a little bit cautious of running anywhere 20 or lower. But it is such a fine line because, if you don't have the Familiars, then you do need the extra mana to be able to cast these heavy flashback costs. You do need the extra mana to hardcast a Mulldrifter. And so it's really, really a fine line between the two. And I know I keep saying that, but I'm just trying to emphasize that as best I can. So I think maybe I would personally drop this by 1, and I'll talk about it in the deck. I'm going to play around with some cards. I'm recording this before I'm putting the article touches. Oh man, talking is not my strong suit today. Putting the final touches on the article. So I'm going to play around with some options, and I'll show you guys kind of what I came up with my own personal version of what I think should come out of it. So there you go. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. We will try and get something a little bit more competitive for those of you who prefer that next week. But I thought this was really cool. And like I said, you guys wanted it, and I am more than happy to oblige what you so desire.